Let's have a look at how we can get started with some other programming languages. As we know, software is built using a whole range of programming languages. There aren't just a small handful of programming languages, there are literally thousands of languages. In order to best harness the power of the computer, we need to be able to work with a number of different programming languages, not just with one programming language. Now, learning a new language might appear daunting at the start, particularly if this is your first language. Learning the first language is hard enough, but the good thing to know is that with the right approach, you'll realize that you actually know most of what you need to know to pick up a new language already. So let's get started and see how we can put the concepts that you already know to use in learning another language. In this case, we're going to pick up the Python language as well. But let's see, in general, how programming languages fit together first. All right, let's start by having a look at the different programming artifacts, so the constructs that we work with. And we should see that these are pretty much the same across both languages. Languages allow you to create programming artifacts, things that you work with in your code, like the programs, functions, procedures, variables, constants, types, etc. This is going to be the same in every programming language. We're always building abstract things inside our code that we can then get the computer to manipulate or to work with. Languages will use the same terms for variables and constants. These are used to store values that either change, so are variable, or values that are constant and don't change. We will always have means of dividing up our functionality. So in structured procedural programs, they're called functions and procedures. When we go to object-oriented programs, those same things are called methods, but basically they're functions and procedures within our classes and our objects. So there's always going to be something like a functional procedure to group together instructions to enable it to do a certain task. And the same things apply. We would want each functional procedure to have one purpose, one task. It would need to be able to accept parameters in order to be given data. It would have local variables internally that it could use. So programming languages will pretty much have these same constructs as well. Where we want to work with multiple values, it will be called an array. And so arrays are used across multiple languages. Sometimes the first value is at index 1, most of the time it's at index 0. So it will be 0 and then each value in subsequent positions with a higher index. So we already know how to work with that. What else is there? Custom data types, well, these will be the same. They might be different in terms of what features they give you or what the language supports, but each language would support a range of custom data types to allow you to organize your data. So you have something like the record or struct in order to have that entity. Classes are then sort of fall into that same domain as well. We have enums and other types as well. The basic idea exists. You can create your own custom data types in these languages. Okay, so the constructs are the same. Let's have a think about the statements. So we've got constructs, the things that we declare and use in our code, and then we have the statements, which are the actual instructions to manipulate those things that we've created. And programming languages basically have the same set of instructions if it's an imperative style language. So these are the languages where we command the computer what to do. And that includes the structured procedural programs and the object-oriented programs as well. If you do something like functional programming, it's slightly different, but this sort of will help you understand how the computer works. Because imperative programming is much closer to the actual hardware itself. We'll have the idea of being able to execute a procedure, whether it's a procedure call or it's called a function call or a method call, it's all the same thing. It's execute that block of code that we created in the function, procedure, method, whatever it happens to be called in the different languages. If we've got variables, that means we're going to have an assignment statement. And the assignment statement is used for the same purpose, to store a value in a variable. We've got variables, there will be an assignment statement, a way of storing a value in a variable. Where there's branching, you'll have branching usually with the if and case statement. That's pretty much the same. It's fairly standard, and in most cases, languages spell if. Amazing. We'll also have loops, so the while loop, for loop, potentially do while. They might have slightly different names, but there'll be a loop that has a precondition test, so like the while loop. There's usually a for loop to enable you to easily iterate over arrays or other collections, and then there'll be a post-test loop like do while, where you check after the body of the loop. We'd also have things like being able to return, so exiting from a function or procedure early and giving back the value that that function or procedure generates, or that would be a function, that a function generates, we have the ability to continue and break out of loops. These are pretty much consistent across all imperative style programming languages. So the great thing is, basically all of that is the same. So what is different? The main thing that's different is what you type. So the text that you type is different in different programming languages. We're still generally thinking the same thing. I want a block of code, so I want a procedure that performs this task. How do I write that in this language? So that's the main difference, is that the text that we type. But there are bigger changes than that. So while the language itself, so the syntax of the language, the rules of the language will be different in terms of what we type, the things that we create are going to be the same, but the library that they support will be different. So each programming language comes with its own library of pre-built artifacts, so pre-built functions, procedures, and depending on what they provide you, you might approach a problem differently. If a language has really, really good support for strings, for example, then maybe you would do it in one way. If it doesn't, then maybe you have to do it some other way using the tools that they do provide you with. So it's just a matter of saying, well, what does this language provide me with? Okay, it's got these tools. That means this language is really going to be good for this project because I want to do those things that it supports really well. Rather than just, okay, this is the language I've got, I have to use the tools that I've got, even though these tools aren't going to help me solve my problem. This is why learning multiple languages is really important. That's what I've talked about. So yeah, as the support of the library changes, it means that you do approach problems in a different way. So here's an example of that. So the string that I used before, different languages have different supports for strings. So down the bottom here we have the C approach to strings. Now the C programming language, not C++, but C doesn't even have a string type. It uses an array of characters. And if we think about it, strings are always arrays of characters. We could have strings that are bigger and shorter, and they're going to need more data. So it's an array. We need to, if we want a longer name, we're going to need to allocate more space for it. If we've got a short name, we don't need as much space for it. So that means that we're pretty much working with a dynamically allocated array. In C, that means you've got to do all of that yourself. You allocate memory for the array, you then store by copying the data from one place to another place using a procedure, and when you finish, you've got to remember to delete it. And so there's really very, very limited support. You have to do everything manually, and it's pretty much a big pain working with strings in C. That's because C is was written to write operating systems, and within the operating system you mostly don't want the overhead of working with strings. You're not interacting with a user. Most of the point of an operating system is to interact with the hardware, and so that code doesn't really need much in terms of the way of string manipulation. Pascal had more basic string support. So it provided a string class. We could add, or string type, we could add together strings. So you could do first name plus a space plus last name, and it would combine those together and store the result in here. So it gave good support for strings, sort of along the lines of what we've got in C++. It's much easier than what we have to do down here. So if you're manipulating strings, then this was a better language to work with. If we go to even newer languages like Swift, so in the Swift programming language, it's got what's called string interpolation. And in this case here, we're saying this string contains at this point, so if you put a backslash and then brackets around something, this expression will be evaluated and injected into the string at that point. So this is called its string interpolation. And it's really a very powerful feature. It makes it really nice and easy to inject values inside strings. But obviously that's much more advanced than the support offered by these other languages. It means that you might approach things in different ways. So there are different things, but it's not mostly around the syntax. It's more around the support for advanced things like string manipulation and the things that the library gives you. So how do we get started? Well, start small, build a Hello World program, get something working, and go up from there. Ideally, try to find someone who knows the language, and you can ask them, how do I do this? But you can also search Stack Overflow, Google, good places to search for how to do X with language Y. So how do I do printing of strings in Python, for example? Will you be able to learn a new programming language? It may seem challenging at the start to consider learning a new language, but the key thing is to realize that you already know most of the things you need to know. It's just about putting those concepts you already know into practice using slightly different text. So the great thing is, with solid understanding of the basics, picking up a new language should be interesting and fun. The second language, I think, is a little challenging to learn because you've got to fully realize that you actually know most of it already. Your third language will be much simpler to pick up. The fourth language will be getting even easier. Fifth and sixth languages, you won't even be worrying about, should I be able to pick this up in a couple of hours? You'll know that you'll be able to do it, and you'll be able to work forward from there. So what we're going to do now is let's have a look at expanding this in the next video with a quick video on getting started with Python. Just to show you the process, I'm not going to go into much details about the language itself. You can do that in your own time. You can do this now. Good luck.